In this final Chapter 8 video, I will talk about how linguists classify languages, which is analogous to how biologists classify species using taxonomy. We have two primary ways of classifying languages that are quite distinct. The first is sort of the Martian approach, in which we look at all of the languages of the world for which we have data and we group them according to similar phonologies, morphologies, and syntax systems. So this is these similarities across languages can happen sort of accidentally. So unrelated languages at faraway distances from each other in the world can sort of accidentally have similar phonological systems or morphology, etc. And then the other way is to reconstruct what is called the genetic relatedness. This has to take into account historical information about speaker populations. So this is also very interesting and tends to have geographical continuity. The word genetic can be a bit misleading because it suggests that all speakers of a related language are genetically related in the assumed sense of sharing DNA among the speakers. And that is simply not always true, right? So we know that people come to speak languages because of conquest, for instance, and then generations later, they don't have any particular close genetic relationship with other people in the world who also speak their language. Okay, so first let's talk about using linguistic traits and comparing that across languages. First, we have to understand notions of similarity, difference, and complexity. So we note that in the world's languages, there are universals. We already talked about this when we learned about universal grammar and a shared template across all languages. This gets into a little more detail about that, and I would like you to retain a couple of examples to illustrate. So, for example, an absolute language universal is absolute, and it's a structural pattern or trait that we find in every single full-fledged human language that we encounter. And an example would be all languages have vowels. There we go. That's a nice, simple one. And then building from that, we recognize the importance of implicational universals. And this concept applies in many other academic and scientific domains. It's important in linguistics as well. So, whereas an absolute universal is in every language, an implicational universal means that the presence of one trait in a language implies that something else also exists in the language. So, for example, all languages that have nasal vowels, like the French um, also have oral vowels. We have no examples of languages that only have nasal vowels. So this becomes kind of a logical superset subset problem. I have a cat climbing on me. Oh dear, she wants to help. She's helping me with my slideshow. Another example, just to kind of illustrate implicational universals, languages that have long vowels that contrast in the language also have contrasting short vowels. Okay. Now, markedness is a very, very important central concept in linguistics. So traits that are marked or marked, however you want to pronounce that, we encounter both ways. Marked traits are considered to be more complex than an unmarked counterpart. Okay, so remember back to phonology when we learned about syllables. Here's a good example. So a CV, consonant vowel syllable, is present in the word paw, for instance. Um, and this happens to be the most universal unmarked syllable across languages. So every single human language allows for that kind of syllable, which is consonant vowel pa. Okay. Um, Slightly fewer languages allow for a slightly more marked syllable, which is consonant vowel consonant, such as in the word pat. Okay. Like he pat the dog. And then a subset of those languages also allow the even more complex syllable, which is consonant vowel consonant consonant, as in the English word packed. So English is showing itself to be rather complex or marked with respect to syllable structure and coda consonants, right? So how many consonants it allows in a single syllable. And where the implicational part is tied into all of this is that languages that allow for a word like packed necessarily allow for a word like pat and paw, okay? What we don't have are examples of languages that only allow for the super complex version of the syllable, as in packed. So we don't have languages that have words like packed, but don't allow words like paw. Okay. Moving on to vowel systems and how we can talk about markedness. The most common vowel system has 5 members, and you should look at this chart here and assume that it's in IPA. So these vowels, as they are listed in IPA, are E, A, O, U, right? 50% of the world's languages have this exact system, meaning that these are the 5 vowels that the language has at its disposal to do vowely things in its words, okay? Some well-known examples are Spanish, Japanese, Hawaiian, and Swahili. Now, true or false? English also has this vowel system. False, right? So this happens to be our spelled vowel system, but remember back to phonetics, we actually have far more vowels than this in spoken English, right? We have E, but also I, which is why we can have a contrast like beat, bit, okay? So we have all the short vowels that correspond to some of these things as well. So we have more like 11 or 12 vowels, whereas these other languages, Spanish, Japanese, etc., truly only have 5 spoken vowels in the language. Okay, this is just a reminder. So some commonalities, some observations about vowels in the world's languages. The vowel ah is found in almost all of the world's languages. Front and low vowels tend to be unrounded. The language with the fewest vowels or language family, I think, are Eskimo languages that have 3 contrastive vowels. So that's a very limited inventory to work with. But of course, we know for English and other languages, you can have 12 or more contrastive vowels in your language. Looking at consonants, some observations. All languages that we've ever studied have stop consonants. The most commonly occurring ones are p, t, and k. And if a language has a fricative, it's probably s. If a language has voiced obstruents, then it also has voiceless ones. Some other classifications. One example does not apply to us as English speakers, but languages use contrast in the form of tone, such as Mandarin Chinese. So we could classify the world's languages as being tone or non-tone. Of course, English is a non-tone language. We don't make use of tone in that way. And then all languages fall somewhere on a continuum of being what we would call isolating on one end of things versus polysynthetic. This is a pretty complicated concept, but it basically means how much meaning is conveyed at the word level using morphemes versus how, and that's in the case of polysynthetic or agglutinating languages, versus how much meaning is conveyed using syntactic grammar and smaller separate words, right? So if a language uses lots of smaller separate words, that's more isolating. If a language uses longer combined words, then that's more polysynthetic. And an example is Turkish, which gets these really long words and is clearly more polysynthetic than English when we look at the translations of these words. So koy means village, koyler, villages, but then you can say koylerin, it's still one word, but it means of the villages. So something that we, as in English, convey with 3 separate smaller words. Some aspect of syntax typologies. Typology, by the way, keeps getting thrown around. It just means how linguists classify languages. On page 313 of your textbook, we see the most common word orders. So S, O, and V means subject, object, verb. Okay. So these are the 3 most common: SOV, SVO, and VSO. And then the rarest, just in terms of languages that we know about that have this word order, are OVS and OSV, which we've only ever encountered in a few South American languages, indigenous languages that we've studied. Here's what some of those word orders look like, by the way. So an SOV word order, if we translate the meaning and like the order that looks like, would mean, in order to say I kicked the ball in Turkish, you have to say I the ball kicked. Okay. If you want to express that same idea in Welsh, you have to say kicked I the ball. That is the syntax template for Welsh. If you want to say the same thing in this South American language, one of those rare ones that has this rare word order, then you have to say the equivalent of the ball kicked I in order to mean I kicked the ball. All right, moving on to genetic classification. So this seeks to group languages into families by use of a comparative method, which we will actually talk more about when we talk about historical linguistics in a couple of chapters. This is difficult. We need lots of data. Sometimes unrelated languages can sort of accidentally be similar, as we've seen. And then, of course, many languages in remote parts of the world, islands, are still undiscovered or barely studied. It's hard to get to those places. And then even if you get there, it's very hard to get lots of really good data, right, to be accepted by the locals and to develop a lexicon and to do a good study as an outsider. So in your textbook, there's a lot of information about language families. You do not need to memorize the language tree. Thank goodness, because it's huge. That would be possibly in an entire class devoted to language classification and typology. So we're not going to do that. I just want you to keep track of our own language family and kind of where English is situated, what some of the related languages to English are. So be aware of our relatives, be aware of where we stand in the family tree as English speakers. So Indo-European is our language tree, but here are some other trees: Uralic, Altaic, Austroasiatic, and some examples. And then we have 2 interesting cases of isolates. They're called isolates because we don't really know exactly where they came from or what they're related to. Basque is a really interesting one, spoken in the Pyrenees mountain region, on both sides of the France and Spain border, and it's this language that has zero resemblance to either Spanish or French. It has been preserved. There are still speakers of Basque because living in mountains can make you very remote. And so, over millennia, they were able to resist the influence of the Roman conquest, and the Latinization of Spain and France that later led to Spanish and French and many other languages. So, looking at our own family, the Indo European family, we have 9 main branches, right? And we can guess what types of languages, modern living languages, are descended from these. Italic uh, gave way later to Italian. Slavic, gave way to some languages that we know about. English is situated in the Germanic branch. So English is a Germanic Indo-European language. Here's an image that shows our branch of the, or sort of half of the Indo-European branches. Okay, again, do not memorize this, but just take a look and see where English is. Where our closest living relatives are German and Scandinavian languages like Norwegian, Danish, and Icelandic. And then Indo-European languages also exist in other parts of the world, much farther away. So Slavic languages led to modern day Serbian, Russian, and others. Indo-Iranian languages are spoken today throughout Pakistan and India. So modern day Hindi and Urdu are in the same family as English, which may surprise some of you. And we see other examples too. Again, don't memorize this. Thank you for staying tuned, and I look forward to having your attention for our next video.